Where Man and Monster Meet. The Legend of Polaris. Read 1. Ken Riley. You're thinking about her, Christopher said, as he watched David stare into his mug of ale. After many years of friendship and being students together, Christopher knew just about everything concerning David, and he read him like a book. "Aren't you?" David answered, looking up with a smirk. "Yes, but not in the same way," Christopher countered. The two young men had arrived in the city of Loredana earlier that day, and though they now sat unnoticed in the corner of an inn, they had drawn too much attention to themselves upon their entrance. David's eyes returned to his ale. It was rare for David to run out of words. Christopher decided he would address the thing neither of them wanted to talk about yet. New must be discussed. "You're going to see her, aren't you?" Christopher asked. "When a princess has requested your presence, it would be impolite to make her wait, wouldn't it?" David asked. "I think she's already forgotten you," Christopher said, with dry sarcasm. "I think you're jealous. Why don't you come with me?" David asked, raising his mug to his lips before adding with a laugh, "You can keep me in line." This time it was Christopher's turn to stare into his mug. "No," he said, "I think it's best if at least one of us keeps a low profile," he finished with a wicked smile. David laughed. The two young men ordered another round of drinks before Christopher looked at David. "One should not keep a princess waiting," he said. David looked out a nearby window. It was dusk, and a soft mist had begun to fall, as it often did at night at Loredana. And a soft mist had begun to fall, as it often did at night at Loredana. "What about you?" David asked. "I have eaten well, drunk even better, and have already paid for a room here for 10 days. Christopher answered. "I won't be sitting up worrying about you, if that's what you are asking." David laughed before finishing his drink and rising. "I will try not to wake you when I return," he answered, dropping a few coins on the table. He turned and headed to the door, looking back once to see Christopher wave at him in a patronizing fashion, before trying to flag down a waitress. He turned and headed to the door, looking back once to see Christopher wave at him in a patronizing fashion, before trying to flag down a waitress. David shook his head as he stepped into the mist and began to head in the direction of the castle. Loredana was a smaller city, walled in by ramparts, and the castle could be seen from just about every direction. David felt grateful that he would not have to ask anyone for directions. He liked the people and enjoyed their conversations, but he and Christopher had had a full day. They had arrived in the mid-afternoon, and after finding an inn, had begun to wander and explore the city. He had been looking for Christopher in a crowd when the people had parted before him, as if they were waves and he stood on the bow of a ship. It was then he had seen her, Adrienne, the princess of Loredana, trotting towards him on her horse. He had been so taken with her, he had not noticed the people behind him had also begun to split and back away. He stood oblivious in the center of the road, like an outlaw, or perhaps an idiot, coming to challenge the local authority. One of her royal guards had to shove him to the ground and raise his weapon to beat David when the princess had commanded her man to step away. She had dismounted, and noticing David's robes, asked if he was from the academy. The academy was what everyone called it. That is, when people spoke of the school deep within the mountain, Polaris. Most people thought it was a school for young wizards, as every student was given a plain gray robe to wear throughout their time there. David's parents had been farmers and had saved for many years to be able to send him to the academy. He had admitted that he was a student of the academy, knowing his simple admission could cost him his life. He had somehow sensed this was not her intention. Instead, he had instructed her guards to leave him, and, as the captain of the guard had helped her onto her horse, she had looked back at him and requested his presence at the castle at his earliest convenience. He raised his hood as the rain began to fall heavier. He slowed his pace in hopes that by the time he arrived at the castle, the princess would be asleep, and he could leave a message. He still had qualms about his visit, not for fear of death, but rather for something he could not discern. He felt as if he were walking into a dark, empty cave. There was nothing to fear, and yet there was some ominous feeling he could not shake. His internal struggle grew with each step, and he debated returning to the inn and forgetting the whole escapade, but he could not. He wanted to see her again. He wanted to look into the depths of her eyes and listen to the stories they would tell. He imagined being in her presence. As David approached the castle gate, 2 guards came out to question him, before a 3rd guard recognized him by his robes, and he then waited with the guards as they sent word to the princess. After some time, he was escorted by 2 new guards into the castle. Walking through the tight, quiet corridors of stone vaguely reminded him of the academy. It was not a long journey, just long enough for David's anxiety to begin to dissipate. Then they passed through the threshold of the throne room. He wasn't sure if the rainwater had made his hands wet, or if it was the clammy sweat that comes before speaking to a room full of people. He guessed it was the latter, as his heart began to drum a furious rhythm. The throne room was large and circular, with marble tiered platforms that rose up in the center to hold a throne. There sat the princess. David respectfully bowed and waited to be addressed. "David," she cried, "I knew you were coming. I just knew it." She laughed, amused by David's clear confusion from her casual greeting, and gestured for him to come toward her. He obeyed. She rose from the throne and descended the steps towards him as she spoke. "I am Princess Adrienne. My father is the king, and he's presently away at war. There's no need for all of the formalities with me." David stared at her, confused. "I am afraid I don't understand, Princess." "Please, call me Adrienne." "Adrienne," he corrected himself. "You wished to speak with me?" It was not a statement, but a question. "I have always desired to meet a wizard," she said. "I do not wish to disappoint you, but I am not a wizard," he corrected. "But you wear the robes of the academy," she countered in a diplomatic tone. "I am afraid many people believe the academy teaches young wizards due to our attire and our concealment from the world." As his heart began to drum a furious rhythm. The throne room was large and circular, with marble tiered platforms that rose up in the center to hold a throne. There sat the princess. David respectfully bowed and waited to be addressed. "David," she cried, "I knew you were coming. I just knew it." She laughed, amused by David's clear confusion from her casual greeting, and gestured for him to come forward to her. He obeyed. She rose from the throne and descended the steps towards him as she spoke. "I am Princess Adrienne. My father is the king, and he's presently away at war. There's no need for all these formalities with me." David stared at her, confused. "I am afraid I don't understand, Princess." "Please, call me Adrienne." "Adrienne," he corrected himself. "You wish to speak with me?" It was not a statement, but a question. "I have always desired to meet a wizard," she said. "I do not wish to disappoint you, but I am not a wizard," he corrected. I do not wish to disappoint you, but I am not a wizard, he corrected. But you wear the robes of the academy, she countered in a diplomatic tone. I am afraid many people believe the academy teaches young wizards, due to our attire and our concealment from the world. David began carefully, for fear of offending the princess. But the academy does no such thing. It is simply a school, specifically for doctors, lawyers, and philosophers. Oh, she said, contemplating his words. David stood in silence, watching her. She was so elegant, so regal, and yet so young. And which do you study? She asked. I am a student of philosophy. David watched her face illuminate. Can you tell me about students of philosophy? Or can you not tell me because it's a secret? She asked. David smiled a reassuring smile. I can tell you anything. What would you like to know? Why are you here in Loredana? She asked. Honestly, I don't know, he added. She stared at him, puzzled. Honestly, I don't know, he said. She stared at him, puzzled. The final step before graduating the academy is to take a trip to practice your craft. Doctors go to towns and cities to heal people. Lawyers leave to practice the law. And philosophers, he paused, I confess I don't know what it is that we are supposed to do. Well, what is it exactly that a philosopher does? The princess asked. We search for and study the truth. We search for and study the truth, David answered. Then you must be here to learn, she stated. Learn what? He pressed. About my people and what truth is to them. David considered this. I think I'd like to learn this philosophy, Adrienne announced. Would you teach me? It would be an honor, David answered. And I can teach you magic, Adrienne said, with excitement. She watched as David's face changed to a look of disapproval. I'm sorry I didn't tell you. You must hate me, she said, her face crestfallen. I don't hate anyone, David assured her. I knew you were a magician. How? She whispered. I don't know. I just knew. Then why did you come? I hear the students of the academy hate magicians. We don't hate them. We just fundamentally disagree with them. Philosophers search for the truth. Magicians look for ways to mask and distort it. David paused to see if he should continue. I hear the master magician was a philosopher until he was expelled from the school. He wasn't expelled. He left, and he was right to leave. They would not permit the use of any magic, she stated with a hint of defiance in her tone. Because it's dangerous, retorted David. It is not. Have you ever tried it? Adrienne countered. No, David admitted. Not even white magic? She continued. It is forbidden. Philosophers don't use any kind of magic, ever, David explained. Well, we will have to fix that. Here, let me teach you, she said, reaching into a pocket and produced a small, orb-like object. Please don't, he said, covering her hands with his, masking and avoiding what she held. Her hands locked with his, and he realized she could have had him executed for touching her. Please don't, he said, covering her hands with his, masking and avoiding what she held. Her eyes locked with his, and he realized he could not. Covering her hands with his, masking, avoiding what she held. Please don't, he said, covering her hands with his, masking and avoiding what she held. Her eyes locked with his, and he realized she could have him executed for touching her. He became conscious of her touch. His hands felt smooth. He became conscious of her touch. Her hands felt smooth and delicate, the hands of a princess. All right, she whispered. her eyes catching his. "Tell me about how you became a magician," David said, releasing his grasp. Adrienne blushed. "I never planned on becoming a magician." "Tell me about how you became a magician," David said, releasing his grasp. Adrienne blushed. "I never planned on becoming a magician. After my mother's death, my father became obsessed with war. He is constantly away, either ending battles or starting new ones. Sometimes it feels like he's not out to get his enemies, but rather he wants to kill himself. Losing a loved one is a very difficult thing. We all grieve in different ways," David offered. "It's no excuse to treat your daughter as if she died too," Adrienne answered, her temper flaring for a moment. David nodded in silence. "It was the plague," she said, a tear slipping from her eye. "The only thing my father couldn't protect her from." David wanted to offer comfort, but feared words would fall short, and a friendly touch would be inappropriate. She looked away, regaining her quiet composure. "I have grown up alone in this place," she continued. "At first, it was a childish desire to play tricks on people for amusement. It was all fun, and harmless, really. When I heard the master magician had come to town, I went to him, and after being amazed by his tricks, I begged him to take me on as an apprentice. It has been years now, and I have learned a great deal from him. Oh, David, you must let me introduce the two of you when he returns to visit." The words hit David like arrows. She knew the master magician, and he was her tutor. "I don't know," he said. "Perhaps you're right," she said, stifling a yawn. "It's too soon." "It's getting late, Princess. You should rest," David suggested. "I don't want to," she sighed, "but you're probably right." And taking him by the elbow, she accompanied him to the door. As she opened it, a guard appeared, awaiting instruction. The princess commanded him to deliver David to his lodging, and then she turned to David. "You will come back, won't you?" she asked. "Of course," he said with a smile. The princess quickly kissed him on the cheek and left him standing speechless, his face filling with heat. Then she disappeared, and the guard led him by the shoulder out of the castle. He contemplated his visit the whole journey back to the inn. He recalled every word she had spoken, wondering if they possessed some hidden meaning. He couldn't subdue his smile. Although probably intended to be a friendly gesture, he could not help but wonder if perhaps there was more behind the kiss. He couldn't subdue his smile. Although probably intended to be a friendly gesture, he could not help but wonder if perhaps there was more behind the kiss. David awoke to the sound of a rooster crowing. At the academy, the students had awoken each morning to the gentle toll of a bell. David rose from his bottom bunk and went to the window of the room. He opened the wooden shutters and saw the rooster look down upon him in a quizzical cock of its head, as if wondering what had taken him so long to respond to its call. It crowed again. The sun had barely begun to rise, and David decided he hated roosters. He walked to the basin of water, which had been left out, and washed his face, and after seeing Christopher was not in the top bunk, headed down to the main part of the tavern for breakfast. Christopher was already at the table eating. David got his food from the innkeeper's wife, who was cooking eggs over the fire, before joining Christopher at the table. "How long have you been awake?" David asked. "A while," Christopher answered, in his usual cryptic way. "I was not out late on secret errands," he teased. "Nor was I," David answered. "Yet it is no secret. You know where I was." Even over the din of breakfast, the rooster's crow could be heard. David winced. "I'm going to kill that wretched animal," he said. Christopher laughed. "So," David continued, "do you have any idea what we are doing here?" Christopher chewed his eggs thoughtfully before answering. "Well, we have 10 days before we must return to the academy. The other students will be practicing their crafts, healing people or practicing law in other cities, and he paused, "I think we are just here to help people." "Interesting," David said. Adrienne suggested, "We are here to learn." "I would imagine it's a bit of both," he stated. "One should learn from all situations." David took another bite of food before Christopher pressed, "So are you going to leave me in suspense, or are you going to tell me about your visit?" David looked at the table and smiled, memories of the prior night flooding in his mind. For a moment he forgot they were in the middle of a tavern in a foreign city, and it felt as if they were back at the academy, Christopher teasing him about some crush in front of their friends. "I'm tempted to leave you in suspense," David answered. Christopher laughed, knowing part of David's ability to deal with life was to talk about it. He would sooner learn to fly than he would to keep his mouth shut. "She's lonely," David stated. "She's a princess with an absent father. She has maids and servants, but no friends, no real conversations or connections." Christopher studied David as he gave his synopsis. "Except maybe," David paused, "for the magic magician." He had expected a look of surprise, or even an outburst from Christopher, neither of which came. Christopher listened, hands folded on the table, and after a moment of silence he chimed in. "Are you surprised to learn she is a magician?" he asked. David shrugged. "I was just surprised to find she knew the master magician." Christopher didn't comment. "She wants to learn philosophy," David continued. "I had a feeling she might," Christopher answered. "So will you be returning to her?" "Yes," David answered. "Do you think it unwise?" Christopher pondered the question for a moment before answering, "Not at this time." After breakfast, Christopher and David left their lodgings to explore the city of Loredana. Anxiety built up in David as they walked through the city market. The academy had been small, and he had never seen so many people in one place. Vendors lined the congested streets, waving and shouting, trying to capture some passerby's attention. After having to speak with 2 separate merchants, trying to leave each without losing any of his money, David was quick to learn not to look anyone directly in the eyes. Occasionally, a child would brush by David's leg unaccompanied as he or she ran through the crowd. The sounds of customers arguing with merchants and husbands and wives filled David's ears, and somewhere in the distance he could hear a baby crying. Everyone appeared to be in a great hurry, giving birth to a mild form of chaos as people pushed their way through the crowd. In the midst of it, David could not help but feel a little lost. By mid-morning, David and Christopher had explored several sections of the city and had developed a plan. They only had enough money to pay for their food and lodging during their 10-day visit to Loredana. They made their way out to the countryside and found a farmer who was willing to spare a few coins for a bit of work. He was an older gentleman, a widower. He had told them running a farm was hard work, even more so when you did it alone. The two spent several hours in the field harvesting wheat alongside him. After the sun had reached its zenith, they collected their few coins and told him that they would return the next day if he would like. He accepted their offer. By late afternoon, David and Christopher had once more found themselves in the strange cacophony of the city. They used the few coins they had gained from their work to purchase several loaves of bread and a cheap but sturdy sack to carry it all in. Then they began to roam the poorer sections of the city. Tearing the bread into smaller portions, they distributed it to whomever they could. Even after they had exhausted their supply of bread, they remained, caring for the sick and speaking with them, learning their stories and their ways. By dusk, they returned to their lodging, tired and very hungry themselves. They each ordered a mug of ale and received a generous portion of the stew that had been prepared earlier in the day. They found a table to sit at, and they were both relieved to be off their feet. Over dinner they discussed the events of the day and the people they had met, the widowed farmer and his difficult work, the baker who would charge you less if you knew a little bit of local gossip, and the girl with a disingenuous smile sewn on her face that they had met in the darker section of the city. Once they had finished their supper, they ordered another round of drinks. They sat in silence, enjoying the revelry of their neighboring tables, watching the other men and women who had also experienced a full day's work. "You're going to see her, aren't you?" Christopher asked, the question coming from nowhere. "Yes," David answered, a strange sense of guilt covering him. There was nothing wrong with his decision. In fact, it was a good opportunity. The princess had asked him to visit her to discuss philosophy. How would it appear if he did not show up? It may have been somewhere inside of himself that he felt it was not a wise decision, or perhaps he simply did not want to leave Christopher's good company. "I know," Christopher responded. David detected in his friend's voice, which he had almost questioned. Instead, he nodded and rose from the table. "Be careful," Christopher warned. "Always," David replied, his typical response. David arrived at the castle and was surprised to find Adrian had left a personal guard to wait for him. The same guard who had recognized him the day before greeted David and introduced him as his personal escort, another guard who stood close behind. The man did not offer a greeting outside of a simple nod and then beckoned for David to follow. He led David through several hallways and corridors, and David admired the tapestries and other artwork that decorated the palace. It wasn't until they passed the empty throne room that David began to question their journey. He asked where they were going, but the guard continued walking. David froze. If he turned back now, he was pretty sure he could still remember most of the way back to the entrance. His guard stopped with him, and, after giving David a moment, he gestured for him to follow again and continued walking. Together they ascended a staircase and came to a gold-plated door. The guard knocked twice and stepped back, standing at attention. "Enter," someone called. The guard opened the door and motioned for David to enter. As David stepped through the door, he felt as if he had stepped into another world. Up until this point, the castle had just been a castle. A stone castle surrounded by a walled city and a bridge, which drew the line between the common folk and the king's home. This room, however, looked as if it had been from a distant land. Warm candlelight and the pale rays of the moon provided a low illumination. Exotic flowers surrounded the edges of the beautifully designed marble floor, which had been crafted in raised and lowered sections. The lower sections seemed to be for entertaining guests. David assumed as he noted the cushions in each. The raised section, however, flowed like a frozen river, which in turn led to the center of the room, where a large bed lay. Several pearl-white marble pillars held up the ceiling, and in the far side of the room, David could see a moonlit balcony, which was separated from the main room by translucent drapes. The sound of a light rain met his ears, along with the sweet sing-song voice of the princess, who rose from the edge of her bed and crossed the room towards him. "You came back," she said. "Did you ever doubt me?" he asked, not meaning to sound quite as teasing as he did. "No, not you," she smiled, embracing him. "It's late. I hope you don't mind meeting here," she said, motioning around her room. Not at all, he said. Where do we begin? She asked. With the fathers of philosophy, he replied. It sounds more like a history lesson, she said, stepping down into the lower portions of a room and sitting on a cushion. Truth is not limited by time, he answered, sitting close but across from her. So let's start with the here and now, she amused. Why bother with men who died thousands of years ago? It's not that simple, David replied. At the creation of the world there was chaos and strife. The ancients themselves came down to teach the fathers the truths of life, which became philosophy. It was one of the few times in history the ancients ever walked among men. And who are the ancients? Adrienne asked. No one knows. Maybe gods, angels perhaps. Some individuals claim to have seen them in times of extreme peril, but, historically speaking, the teaching of the fathers is the only instance in which multiple people saw them. Interesting, Adrienne sighed. She still did not seem impressed. If anything, she seemed bored, looking down at her fingernails. Perhaps this is not the best approach, David thought before asking. Why don't you tell me what you believe? Adrienne looked up, smiling. I believe we are here and now. I believe we live to experience, and I believe if it's not hurting anyone, it's fine, she said, leaning in close to him as she said each word. David realized the room was rather dim. A brief wind passed through, rustling the thin drapes and tugging at the small flame of each candle. A sweet but subtle fragrance filled his nostrils, and the tiny lights reflected from her eyes. The room around him began to fade away into the dimness, and he saw only her face looking back at him, studying him, searching him. David debated what to say, once again afraid of offending her. So you don't believe in things beyond the here and now? If they are, then, as you say, beyond, she smiled, leaning back on her cushion, let people be people. We live, we die. It's as simple as that. Then what is the point? He asked. Whatever matters to you, she answered, glancing at her fingernails again. What if I believe in destruction? He pressed. As I said, if it's not hurting anyone, it's fine. She looked up, searching his eyes again. Besides, no one in their right mind wants destruction. David didn't respond. This conversation was not going as he had intended. He almost laughed at himself. What had he expected? To win over a princess in a brief conversation? He watched her as she looked up from her fingers. She was so full of life and so beautiful. Dark locks framed her face like a precious pearl. What? She asked. Nothing, David said, shaking his head as if to wake himself from a daze. What is the first thing you were taught in magic? A flare. A flare? May I? She asked in a patronizing tone. David nodded. She rose and crossed the room to a desk. She returned and produced a coin, holding out both hands, one with the coin resting flat against her palm and the other empty. A flare, she began, is the way a magician controls his audience and guides them. As she said this, there was a quick flash of light on the empty hand. David glanced at the flash, and in the millisecond it took, the coin disappeared from her other hand. It's a simple misdirection, she stated, impressed by the flare, but not by the trick. Not always, she said, extended her newly empty hand towards him. This time there was a quick flash, and the coin appeared in the same hand. David stared at it in awe. It's juvenile, really, she said. I don't think flares were designed to give young magicians more confidence. Because if you are really good, she twisted her wrist over, once over and then back, and the coin was gone. You don't need it, she whispered. David's mind began racing. Reason dictated that this had merely been a trick, but his eyes would not agree. No matter how hard he reasoned, he could not figure out how she had done it. Well, he said, clearing his throat, the fathers of philosophy are like flares. They show us where to look. It didn't sound as clever as he had hoped when he heard it out loud. He could tell by her face she was waiting for him to ask how she had done it. He refrained. His purpose there was to discuss philosophy, not magic. He watched the candlelight dance in her eyes. They each waited for the other to break the silence, but it was a comfortable silence. They sat simply gazing at each other, locked in a childish game of trying to read the other's thoughts. "You should stay here," she said, breaking the spell. "I'm sorry," he asked, pulled from his thoughts. "You should stay with me," she repeated, "here in the castle. There are plenty of rooms, and it is clear we will not resolve philosophy in a night. We will need several nights at least." "I'm afraid I must return to my companion," David answered. "That's fine," she smiled, rising and motioning for him to do the same. "Think about it," she said, kissing him on the cheek again. She then turned David by the shoulders to face the guard, who had led her to her chambers. He wondered how long the guard had been there, or if he had ever left. "Interesting," Christopher said, once David finished his retelling of the prior night's events, leaving out the part where the princess had invited him to stay. He had arrived back at the tavern to find Christopher already asleep. David had reflected on the night's events over a single drink before laying in his own bed and falling asleep. In the morning, the two had eaten breakfast together and discussed their plans for the day. David had told his tale as they had begun to work once more for the old widowed farmer, cutting wheat. "Perhaps you shouldn't go back," Christopher suggested. "Why is that?" David asked, swinging his scythe. "The princess doesn't seem to care for philosophy," David said. David's irritation began to grow inside of him. "All good things take time, my friend," David said, defending her. "Like this wheat, it takes a full season for it to grow. It requires time and sacrifice." "I know," Christopher answered, stopping to wipe the sweat from his brow, "but I think this will lead to time and compromise. Do you remember the difference?" The heat of the afternoon was beating down upon them, and yet David felt a separate heat rising within him. "Yes, Master Christopher," he answered, insulted. "To sacrifice is to give up something you want out of love. Compromise is surrendering something you believe to get the bare minimum." "Don't patronize me. I'm trying to help," Christopher replied. "Then help me," David grumbled, before collecting himself. "How do I teach her?" David stopped altogether and thought about this. "I can see you care about her," he began, "but this is not an exam. You can't just write down the answer and expect it to be over. We teach people the truth by how we live and what we leave behind." David continued harvesting the wheat, listening, but not acknowledging anything of what his friend said. The anger within him had peaked. He had known Christopher would say these words, not just because he knew Christopher so well, but because if their positions had been reversed, David would have said the same thing. "Is it true we have to meet people where they are at?" Christopher continued. "It just feels like she is inviting you to join her. Does that make sense?" he asked. David tensed at the phrase, as she had invited him to join her, not in her beliefs per se, but in her castle. "Was there anything else?" Christopher asked. "No," David lied. His first compromise. The night rain had just begun to fall as David entered the marketplace. Most of the vendors and merchants had already packed their carts, but a few remained in the hopes of one final sale. David stopped at a small fruit stand, and after examining the apples, purchased one, leaving the man a little more money than necessary. He did this for two reasons. First, he figured if the merchant was there at this hour, he must have someone depending on him, and David wanted to help. Second, he had used the transaction as an excuse to look around and see if he was being followed. Christopher was no idiot. He knew David had continued to see Adrienne since their conversation in the field only a few days before. But David was afraid of the judgment which would come if he confessed to Christopher where he was going. They had needed a lie, or rather an excuse to ignore the truth to spare them further confrontation, an excuse for him to leave each night. He had told Christopher that he would be out visiting the nearby churches and temples. He had said he had wished to talk to the church's priests and learn more about their religious beliefs. Christopher had not questioned this. David felt ashamed, but could not discern why. He had gone to see the princess. He was trying to teach her. Wasn't that the point of this whole endeavor? To teach people? David polished the apple on his robe as he continued on towards the castle in the rain, thunder gently rumbling in the distance. Yes, he had seen a little magic, but he had only let Adrienne perform magic for him and to show he cared about what mattered to her. He was fostering a connection, and in time, perhaps, he could change her mind. It would be a delicate task, requiring time and sacrifice. David winced, remembering his conversation in the field with Christopher. The reality was that he was trying to do the right thing, and he wasn't hurting anyone. In fact, her magic tricks had seemed quite innocent and fun. He continued on in his thoughts, still feeling the qualms he always did, as he stepped out onto the drawbridge and approached the castle gate. He had taken his first bite of the apple when he heard his name. He turned to see Christopher, looking disappointed. "You've been following me," David accused. "You've been lying," Christopher responded. The rain seemed to fall heavier with his words. "I am here to help her," David said, his voice rising with a roll of thunder. "You're here because you are infatuated," Christopher replied. "What if I can save her?" David shouted. "And what if she destroys you?" roared Christopher. "She's changed you." Lightning shattered the sky, followed by a thunder crash which seemed to shake the ground. Anger surged in David. There would be no more arguing. This had become a crossroad, and he could no longer stand in the middle. He had to choose. Could he return with Christopher, or could he stay and try to teach Adrienne? Why couldn't Christopher understand? They were here to help people, and he was helping Adrienne. He would teach her philosophy and be her friend, and she did not seem to have any. Both Christopher and Adrienne were David's friends, and he did not want to choose between them. Christopher's words rang in his ears with the thunder. "What if she destroys you? What if?" "We study the truth, but that doesn't make us fortune-tellers," David said. Then he returned towards the castle and entered the gate. David stood, cold and wet from the rain, waiting for admission to see Adrienne. Although he had become familiar to the guards, there were still certain precautions and formalities to be observed. Listening to the soft sound of each drop of water dripping from his cloak, David felt like a man in a trance, hypnotized by the words of someone who had once been his closest friend. What if she destroys you? He hadn't meant for it to happen, but one of his greatest childhood fears had become a reality. He had lost his best friend, his brother, and now stood alone. David closed his eyes, taking a deep breath followed by a deeper sigh. He needed a clear mind. He needed a warm bed and sleep. He would deal with it tomorrow. A small but warm tingling of excitement rose in his chest when the guard returned and motioned for him to follow. He would get to see Adrienne. Following close behind his escort, David entered the throne room. When Adrienne saw him, she left her father's throne, gliding down the steps to embrace him. She stopped short when she saw his condition and wasted no time ordering one of the maids to see that he had a warm bath and a fresh robe. The bath rejuvenated his spirits, and the robe made him feel like a king. He was then escorted to a bedroom where he waited until the princess came calling. "Have you come to stay?" she asked hopefully, as he opened the door to greet her. "If you wish, I shall," he answered. "Well, I wish," she grumbled. Then, sensing his discomfort, she inquired, "David, what's wrong?" "It's nothing," he sighed. "I just had a fight with Christopher, and I'm afraid it has ended a very good friendship." "I'm sorry. Was he the other student you traveled with?" David nodded. "And you were fighting about me?" she asked, an innocent look in her eyes. David nodded again. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "It's not your fault," David reassured her with a weak smile. "Here, let me cheer you up," said Adrienne, taking him by the hand and drawing him deeper into the room. They sat on the edge of his bed, and Adrienne reached over, taking both of his hands in hers, and turned his palms up. She flashed her girlish smile at him before staring with greater intensity at his hands. She traced over parts of his palms with her thumbs. "I see here you've had a sheltered life, spending little time in the world and much of your time in contemplation," she said, pointing to two intersecting lines. "This mark shows sorrow, pain, and anger. No doubt from your broken friendship." She paused for a moment and looked back at his eyes. "But that's not all, is it? There's a void of unspeakable depth, much deeper than anything you believe can fill." "Deception will not cheer me, but thank you," David began to retract his hands. Adrienne looked embarrassed before regaining her charm. "You didn't let me finish," she whispered. "I'm listening," he retorted. Without missing a beat, she looked at him with her deep green eyes, locking him in her gaze. "I see you will be satisfied. Not now, but soon. Soon you will forget, and you will be pleased." Their gaze held for a moment longer before she broke it off. "It's late. I must go," she whispered, and David walked her over to the door. Just before she left, she turned to face him one last time, as though she were waiting for him. He felt a sudden urge to kiss her, and, for a moment, thought she might fulfill this desire. Then she departed without a word, leaving David confused and desperate to see her again. The next morning, David awoke in his new room. He pushed himself up from under the covers, resting his head against the headboard and his back on one of the many pillows. The spacious room had been well furnished with chairs, a table, the enormous bed, and even decorative paintings. David's room in the academy had been nothing like this. For many years he had lived in a small rectangular room that had resembled a prison cell more than a bedchamber. He had never minded it. It had been simple and served its purpose. Now here, lying in the bed, he decided that it would not take him long to adjust to the change. He rose to find a new set of clothes that had been laid out for him. He looked to where he had left his academy-issued robe the night before, only to find that it had been removed. He sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, and the events of the past few days catching up with him. Christopher would return to the academy in just a few short days, and David wondered what story would be told. Christopher would probably tell everybody how David had been a fool, how he had not wished to help people so much as he had wished to woo a beautiful princess. His mind reeled as the thought of everyone he had known at the academy, imagining their shock and horror as they realized David had lied, left, and would not return. He would return, though, wouldn't he, after he had taught the princess philosophy? But David knew that most students who didn't return when they were supposed to rarely ever returned at all. He felt the fabric of his new clothes as he began to dress himself. afraid to listen for his heart's answer. He rose and walked to the window, which overlooked the city. No, he thought. He and Christopher had been best friends. Christopher would not slander him. He would tell them all the truth, and he ran his fingers through his hair. What is the truth? He wondered. He heard Adrienne's soft footsteps approaching on the stone and waited for her to address him. Just the sound of her sweet voice could make him smile, but as he turned to her, he could tell something was wrong. Adrienne, what's wrong? He asked, concerned. David, I don't know how to ask you this, but I really want to introduce you to the master magician. I know you just lost a good friend, and I think it would help to take your mind off things. It would mean a lot to me. And David shook his head. I am not allowed to participate in this kind of lie. It's too dangerous. I really shouldn't have even let you show me what you did. But why can't you learn magic? Adrienne whined. It's not dangerous like your teacher said. It's just a bunch of fun, harmless tricks, I promise. Don't you trust me? I do trust you. I don't know, replied David, unconvinced about the whole thing. Adrienne snuggled in close to his arm. Tell you what, I will start to teach, and as soon as you think it's too much, we can stop. David hesitated, considering her offer. All right, sounds reasonable. Adrienne's deep green eyes brightened. You're going to love it, she exclaimed. I must prepare. Go to the gardens after lunch, and I will meet you there. And without another word, she turned and left him alone with his thoughts. A servant brought his lunch to his room. Though the whole experience was something quite foreign to him, he found it refreshing. At the academy, all students ate together, though it was good to see friends. Sometimes it felt better to be alone with one's thoughts. This was one of those times. A lot had changed in a short time, and David wanted to think without interruption. He was also certain that if he began wandering around the castle, it would have led to many conversations with the guards. After finishing his meal, David left his room, finding his escort waiting for him. He asked where he could find the gardens, explaining his situation. And just as before, the escort simply nodded and began to lead David through the castle. David still felt uneasy about Adrienne's request. She was going to teach him about magic. He didn't even want to imagine what Christopher would say, but she had made a solid point. If there's no true power behind magic, then there is nothing to be afraid of. They entered the gardens where Adrienne was waiting for him. She wore a light purple dress which hugged her figure. Groups of purple lilacs and white lilies complimented her. Their aroma seems to emanate from her like a perfume. David wondered if he had somehow stepped out of the castle and into a painting. He walked towards her, over a small decorative bridge, which had been installed over an artificial pond. He glanced down for a moment at the still waters, watching the fish. As his eyes returned to Adrienne, he could not tell what was more breathtaking, the glory of the gardens he walked through, or the woman standing within them. She took him by both hands and stepped backwards through the branches of a willow into the shade. He watched as they swayed back into place, creating a sort of protective veil, a bubble for their own little world by the tree. She motioned for him to sit on the ground across from her. "This is beautiful," he said. "For a moment I forgot I was in a castle." "Which is why I had my father build it," she said, looking up at the tree, "for when I wanted to escape." "Here," she said, handing him a small dagger. David examined it, beautifully crafted, yet light, to his surprise. The handle had an artistic image of a snake entwined around it. It looked as though the blade was protruding from the serpent's mouth. David pricked his finger with the very tip of the blade and felt a drop of warm blood begin to run down his hand. "Stab me," Adrienne commanded, a look of mischief on her face. David looked at her in disbelief. No, he stammered. "I don't want to hurt you." "You won't. You can't," replied Adrienne, grabbing David's hand and forcing the blade into her stomach. He watched her eyes bulge, and they seemed to cry out to him in agony and grief. The blade slid out of her as she fell back onto the ground. Lilac petals surrounded her as if they had been left there by design, perfectly arranged to adorn her corpse. David stared, speechless, as the dagger slipped from his hand. She was so still. David inhaled sharply, about to scream for help, when Adrienne's eyes fluttered open. "Did I scare you?" she asked. David expelled the breath he had been holding in. "But you..." And she looked at the knife and back at her. "Magic," she whispered, with a look which was clearly rehearsed. Still feeling his heart racing, David couldn't decide if he should be angry or give in to his curiosity. Adrienne made the choice for him. She picked up the dagger and, skillfully holding the flat of the blade, pushed it back inside its handle. "But how did it not cut you?" Adrienne pressed David's hand to her abdomen. He felt a small metal plate beneath her dress. David nodded as it all came together in his head. "See? Fun and harmless," Adrienne laughed. "I'm not sure if fun is the first word I would pick," David said, still trying to appear upset. Adrienne offered a playful smile. "You're just angry because I tricked you," she said. "Perhaps," he admitted. "Is that it?" he asked. "You have one trick designed to scare the life out of people?" A smile formed on Adrienne's lips, along with the beginnings of a retort, but no words were spoken. David noted a vibrancy in her eyes that he didn't think had been there a moment ago. An idea had just come to her. "I know that look," he said. "What are you thinking?" "Do you trust me?" she asked. "Yes," he answered. Adrienne rose and stepped behind the tree's trunk. When she re-emerged, she had 2 common cloaks in her hand. She handed one to David. "Put this on and follow me," she said. "Pull your hood up. We don't want to get caught." Adrienne led David away from the willow and to the garden wall. She began to remove some of the rocks, revealing a hole just big enough for the 2 of them to squeeze through, one at a time. 2 thoughts crossed David's mind. First, she had done this before, and second, she had planned this from the start. They replaced the rocks, and she led him away from the castle and out into the city, passing through many of the beautiful sections and into the darker ones. She slowed her pace as they approached an old, dingy tavern with a sign over the door that read, "Red Raven Tavern." Several fat old drunks sat on the front steps, making comments at Adrienne. She didn't seem to mind. This is no place for a princess, David thought, and debated asking her if she wanted to leave. One of the drunks stood and began coming towards them. David stepped in front of Adrienne, not sure what he intended to do. He had never been in a fight before, and the academy certainly had not trained him for this. "You gonna be the big man?" the drunk said, close enough now that David could feel his breath. "Want to impress your girlie?" Before David could answer, there was a quick flash of light. The drunk man pushed David out of the way, and David stumbled, his hands turning to fists as he regained his balance. He turned to find the drunk on his knees before Adrienne. "Please, Eris," the man howled. "I don't know what it was. I swear, I didn't know." He was down far enough to kiss her feet. Adrienne removed her hood with an air of drama. "My friend, there is nothing to forgive," she said with a laugh, and the tension left the air. As if the world had shifted from a tragedy into a comedy play, David watched as the other drunks stood up. "You dumb nincompoop," one of them yelled. "It's Eris." Another ran down and kicked the man on the ground out of the way, ushering Adrienne towards the door of the tavern. "Begging your pardon, Miss Eris," he said, flustered. "We didn't mean none of what we said. We was just kidding around, that's all." He turned to David. "I sees you brought a friend," he exclaimed, shaking David's hand a little too fast and a little too long, before motioning for both of them to follow him. He continued on with apologies and told Adrienne how excited everyone was going to be, all the while referring to her as Eris. When they got to the door, the drunk man flung it open with all the hoopla he could muster and shouted out over the noise of the bar that Eris, the magic girl, had returned. As they entered the tavern, everyone stood and cheered. Someone handed Adrienne a fresh drink from the bar. They shuffled her up onto a tiny, rather pathetic stage, and the cheering got even louder. Eris, the magic girl, had become quite a name for herself. David found himself a seat in the corner and watched as she raised her hands. Silence followed, and, as if spellbound, all eyes turned from the bar to her. Eris was more loved than any princess. David watched her performance, admiring the simple yet elegant design of each of her deceptions held. Most tricks involved sleight of hand, while others had props like the fake dagger. She enamored the crowds with her performance, and the more David watched, the more he wanted to learn. After the better portion of an hour, she announced she would be performing her final trick, motioning for David to join her on the stage. "This is my assistant," she started. "What's your name?" she whispered to David. "David," he replied, a bit confused by the question. "This is a show, a performance. Give it some spice," she hissed, becoming aggravated. "This is my assistant," she shouted again to the crowd. "Ulysses, master of trickery," he responded with audacity. The crowd cheered. Adrienne shot him a look that told him he could do better, but it was on the right track. Careful to avoid the audience's gaze, she handed him the serpent dagger. "There will be blood this time, but don't be afraid," she whispered. "Give them a show." David had always hated trial by fire. Whenever he learned something new, he wished he could practice it in secret until he had perfected it. But this was not an option. He had no time to prepare. He had to perform. And the crowd fell silent, and all eyes were upon him. He became uncomfortable as the slight tremors coursed through his hands. His mouth became dry, and he feared he might choke as he addressed the crowd for the first time. "Once upon a time," he smiled and looked to Adrienne, who gave him an encouraging smile, "there was a beautiful princess," and he gestured to Adrienne, and the crowd roared. A small smirk began to crawl across his face as his idea came to life. "And there was a young traveler who fell in love with her." David shrugged his shoulders, indicating himself. The crowd hooted as Adrienne blushed. "But her stepfather," David continued, pulling his hood up over his head and dropping his voice, "her stepfather was an evil man who did not want a rightful heir to the kingdom. Thus he had the princess killed." David brandished the dagger and, with the speed of a snake, plunged it into Adrienne's stomach. The crowd went silent. Adrienne's face contorted into stages of pain and sorrow. David retracted the knife, his hands red and sticky. He watched as blood began to gush from her wound, soaking a dark crimson stain in her light purple dress. The crowd gasped. Adrienne's eyes fluttered, and David caught her gracefully as she collapsed in his arms. All eyes were on the young woman in sheer disbelief and horror. "What have you done?" yelled a man from the crowd. Others joined him, crying out in rage, as though they had been hypnotized. David silenced them with a wave of his hand. "The story is not finished," and David removed his hood and paused. "There was an ancient wandering the earth," he continued, "who heard the cry of the young traveler when he found his lover dead. Seeing the purity of their love, he intervened. As you know, the ancients are not mere men, and they can take different forms. This ancient came to the traveler as a small breeze, whispering one of the oldest truths there is," and David paused, putting a hand to his ear for effect. "True love may conquer anything, even death itself," he whispered, just loud enough for the audience to hear. David sank to his knees and, cradling her body in his arms, kissed Adrienne's lips. He laid her body back on the floor with care and waited. Her eyes shot open as she took a deep, overemphasized breath so the crowd could see. Everybody cheered as David helped Adrienne to her feet and embraced her. "How was that for showmanship?" David asked, speaking low so only Adrienne could hear as the crowd roared. Adrienne looked into his eyes before whispering her response. "Magical." David tapped the arm of his chair. At any moment the door would open, and in would come the sworn enemy of all students of the academy. But what if he will not teach me? What if he makes Adrienne promise not to teach me? As if his thoughts had been audible, Adrienne calmed his fears with a touch of her hand. He took her hand and gazed into her beautiful green eyes. What if I am cast out of Loredana, and I will never teach Adrienne philosophy? David had not thought about philosophy for some time. Wrapped up in Adrienne and all that she had shown him, it seemed to have fallen by the wayside. A pang echoed through his heart again, a knowledge that something was wrong, or perhaps missing, the fear that he would be a failure. His thoughts were interrupted by the opening door. David rose to his chair as Adrienne ran and embraced the man who entered. Everything about him reeked of deception and entertainment. He stood tall, with dark features, sporting a cape that dramatized his every move. But what captured David's attention was the magician's wand. It had been forged in the darkest shade of metal and held significant weight, yet the master moved it with an apparent ease. As a philosopher, David had only heard tell of the object. Legend said that, after leaving the academy, the master had crafted a stick which contained all of his magic, a scepter, a symbol of dominance over the path he had chosen to take. "This must be David," the man said, acknowledging David. Adrienne introduced them. "I've heard a lot about you," the master began. "I hear you would like to learn magic." "Yes, sir. But you are also a philosopher." "I am." David felt his pulse begin to race. The master laughed. "Excellent. That will save time." "It's not a problem?" David asked, confused. "Of course not. Some of the best magicians started off as philosophers. Take myself, for instance. The better one understands truth and how it works, the better one may learn to mask it and deceive people. All in good fun, of course." David laughed in disbelief. He had worried for nothing. The master shook his hand and told him to be with Adrienne at her next training session. Impressed by the man's ability to make complete strangers feel as though they were old friends, David could see the master magician was a fine blend of style and finesse. The master apologized to Adrienne for the brevity of his visit, claiming his presence was required elsewhere. With a flick of his wrist, a bouquet of flowers appeared, and Adrienne's face lit up. She winked at David before disappearing through the door. Both David and Adrienne continued their training under the master magician's tutelage. The more they practiced together, the more David forgot about the ways of the academy. The magician had taught them everything about magic and the arts of deception. He had become very pleased with David, and sometimes would even refer to David as the master. One night, the magician came crashing into David's room, waking him from a deep sleep. Get up, the magician exclaimed. "It's time." "Time for what?" David grumbled, rolling over in his bed. "Time to learn," the magician responded. "Learn what?" David yawned. "I know all there is to do. You taught me everything." "So you think," responded the magician in disgust. "Let's face it," said David, sitting up and rubbing his eyes. "You taught me too well. Now you are just upset because I have surpassed you." "You fool," the master magician hissed, grabbing David by his nightgown and yanking him off his bed. "No student is greater than his master. Make no mistake, boy. You are nothing." "Then what is so important?" "What must you teach me in the dead of night?" David asked, pushing away. The magician responded with one whispered word: sorcery. Over the next few months, David's reality changed. The magician, whom he now knew as the sorcerer, had hidden so much from him. David had heard of sorcery, but never really knew how real it was. Magic had turned out to be a bit of harmless tricks, but there were no tricks in sorcery. It was dark and sinister, and David began to tamper with things better left untouched. At first, David split his time between Adrienne and the sorcerer, spending much of each day with Adrienne, playing tricks on or for people, or just enjoying their time together. But the nights belonged to the sorcerer. Over and over, David practiced enchantments and illusions, but in spite of all of his success, it never pleased his master. He only spurred David on, deeper and deeper into the dark arts. The few times David let the allure of sleep reach through his exhaustion, the sorcerer threatened to find a new apprentice. David devoted more of his time to sorcery, seeking Adrienne less. David became frustrated with himself and his weaknesses, and it drove him to the edge of madness. "David," Adrienne said again, snapping her fingers. David looked up. They both stood next to the throne. He had been away again, lost somewhere in his own mind. It had been happening often, but he couldn't help it. There was something there inside of him, eating him alive. He could not determine what it was, or perhaps remember it. Whatever it was too complex. He had tried for some time to solve the mystery of this darkness that weighed on him like an iron shroud, but it always evaded him. "David, what is wrong?" Adrienne asked, feeling she had his attention. "Nothing," David responded, twisting his scraggly, unkempt beard with a finger. She had interrupted his thoughts again, for the sake of a conversation they had many times. He turned and began to descend the steps, heading for the door, preferring isolation to confrontation. "Too busy for me?" she questioned, half teasing, half hurt. He walked to the edge of the first step. David sighed. When he had first begun learning sorcery, he had also begun distancing himself. Adrienne had initially respected his privacy, but David had known it would only be a matter of time before she began to pry. She had never been one to sit idly by. His time was valuable, far too valuable to be wasted on these questions, but he knew not answering would only make things worse. "I'm sorry. What did you want?" he asked, turning back towards her. Adrienne paused, trying to let go of her frustration at his curtness. "Did you stop loving me?" she asked. "We used to be in love. You used to love my tricks. What happened, David?" A hint of desperation slipped into her voice. David pressed his fingers against his brow in frustration. "I don't know. Do we really have to have this conversation again?" he asked, irritated. "I have things to—" He stopped mid-sentence, looking up to see her now sitting in the throne. Her face had become the stone veil of a practiced princess. She sat still and stoic as a statue, her eyes narrow and empty of emotion as the last of David's echoing words faded away. "Tell me," she said in a dangerous tone, making it clear this was a demand. "What happened to you?" David raised his reluctant eyes to meet hers, knowing his words would sting. The master magician was the closest thing she had to a father. "Our master is teaching me sorcery." Adrienne's eyes widened. "How did this come about?" she asked. "He approached me." "When?" David sighed. "Not long after you introduced us." "I see," she said, considering this information. "Teach me." For a moment, a memory surfaced in David's mind. A vision of the two of them in the same throne room, her requesting he return to teach her. He remembered her bedchamber and his attempt to explain philosophy. A pain spread through his heart. It began sharp like an arrow, and then it lingered like a poison. He felt sick at the memory. Answering the princess's command, he whispered a spell and held out his hand. A tiny dot appeared and began to grow rapidly. He shut his hand before any could escape. "Is that dark energy?" asked Adrienne with a curious look in her eyes. "Yes," David answered. "It's the latest thing I've been working on." "Why did you stop?" "I can't control it yet." As Adrienne rose and walked towards him, they both heard the sound. They had heard it. They didn't know it for what it couldn't have been any louder than the drop of water tapping the surface of a lake. But they both heard it and looked to the floor. A single drop of the amorphous substance had slipped out from between David's fingers and landed on the stone floor, erupting with a tiny splash. A look of horror washed over David's face, and he wasted no time rushing back up the steps to Adrienne and grabbing her by the hand. "We have to go," he shouted, his eyes shifting towards the door, only to find it was too late. The dark energy looked like a thick ink and moved as an army of determined ants. It rushed to the edges of the room and then began to swirl as it moved inwards and climbed each step towards the center like a serpent. "We are trapped," Adrienne cried, as David pulled her closer to him. They stood at the center of the throne room, watching in terror as the black ooze began to climb towards them. "David, do something." I can't," answered David, watching in disbelief. He and Adrienne stood at the small circular platform as the dark energy enveloped the rest of the floor. It reached up the walls like hands stretching for the top of a cage, consuming and spreading until even the ceiling was covered. "Do you love me?" he asked, not knowing where the question had come from. "Yes," she answered, tears beginning to fill her eyes. "I am so sorry," he said. "I didn't want to hurt you." The words called to mind the memory of the first magic trick they had ever performed together. "You can't," whispered Adrienne, but David knew he could hurt her. He had, and he was hurting her. "I love you," he whispered. All of the memories of their time together began to flood his mind, and tears fell from his eyes. He remembered the Red Raven Tavern and their first kiss. He remembered the first trick he had shown him in the gardens. He remembered the first time they met when they had just arrived in the city. He remembered why he had come to Loredana and why he had chosen to stay. He kissed her again. "I was wrong," he whispered, wrapping her in his arms. Like a flare, a blinding light cut through everything, expelling the dark energy with a sound that left David's ears ringing. One moment they had been standing embracing each other, and then next they were on the floor, staring up at both the bright creature and the sorcerer. David and Adrienne watched, terrified, yet in awe, as the mystical battle began. Neither could close their eyes, but both felt they were witnessing something not meant for them to know. David awoke in his old room at the academy. He blinked once, then twice, then sat up, looking around for an explanation. He slid his feet onto the familiar stone floor. One of his old robes had been laid out on the desk before him. He picked it up with a forgotten reverence. It felt so odd and yet so familiar as he rubbed a section of the fabric between his fingers. He draped the garment over his body, letting the hood fall to his back. "Is it really that simple?" he wondered. "Can I just take it back as though I never left?" He looked over his room, examining every detail. The bare stone walls didn't seem so bare anymore. He knew every crack and blemish on them. He ran his hand over the smooth wood of the flat, uncushioned bed. This room, this sanctuary, had been his home. The sound of the great bell brought tears to his eyes, and he wept at the bittersweet experience. A quiet knock on the door pulled David from his thoughts, and he wiped the tears from his eyes. He crossed the room and opened the door to find Christopher waiting. "It's good to have you back," Christopher said, embracing his friend. I'm sorry, David offered. It's okay. We always knew I was the smarter one, Christopher replied, trying to lighten the mood. David laughed before asking, "What happened?" "The last thing I remember, I had—" He stopped, not wanting to tell Christopher about the things he had done. "The porter found you 2 mornings ago at the door of the academy," Christopher stated. "The masters wanted to send me to the nearest town to ask for the news, but I wanted to stay here in case you woke up. So they sent a runner." David paused. "People are saying that one of the ancients appeared in Loredana." He looked to David. "There was a creature," David began, the horrible event flashing back in his mind. "It was so bright. They say an ancient only appears when there is threat of a great evil," Christopher commented. "No one has seen one in centuries." David sat on the edge of his bed, taking it all in. "Where is Adrienne?" David asked. "You were the only one found at the door," Christopher answered. "I'm leaving," David said to Christopher as they ate lunch together. "But you just returned." It was true. It had been several days since David had awoken in the academy, but he knew he could not stay. From the moment his eyes had opened, Adrienne had been on his mind. She would visit him in dreams, reopening his wounds with her knife trick. He had even tried Christopher's suggestion to write to her, knowing she would never see his words. He had written pages and pages, remembering, questioning, and apologizing. There had only been a few moments since his return that he had managed to forget. Then someone would sound a little like her, or even look like her, at a quick glance, and it would all come racing back to him. She had become his mind's prisoner, or perhaps his mind had become hers. David sighed. "I've tried to reclaim my life as a philosopher. I really have. But everything is different now." Christopher looked at him, debating whether or not he should say what he was thinking. "Speak freely," David said. "You know you can't return to her." David nodded, pain flashing through his eyes. Christopher hadn't said this as a command. David could return to Loredana. The academy would not interfere. Both knew in their hearts, if David returned, he and Adrienne would eventually revert to their old ways, and in the end, David would do more harm than good. "I know," he answered. "You love her," Christopher said. "I do." They continued their meal in silence for a while. "So what will you do?" Christopher asked. "Where will you go?" All his life he had searched for the truth. He wanted to know it and to live by it. He knew he could never be with Adrienne, but he had to see her. David looked at his food, but made no effort to eat. "I miss her," he said. "I have to know she's safe." "What if she's not?" David asked, concerned. "Will you intervene?" David felt as though they were standing at the bridge all over again, and he rose from his seat. "I never apologized to you for the way I left things." "You never needed to," Christopher replied, rising as well. "I was wrong," David continued. "You were right. I can't save her. I can only point her in the right direction. Then it's up to her." David gave him a quizzical look. "It doesn't have to be this way, David." "I know," David answered as the noon bell rang. Christopher smiled a sad smile and nodded. They embraced for the final time. David climbed to the top of the great mountain and broke his oath to the truth once more. The wind rose and the mountain quaked beneath him. Using only white magic, he broke the mountain summit and carried it into the sky. Higher and higher he rose until he could see not just Loredana, but the whole world. From the stars he watched his beloved, shining bright flares, desperately trying to guide her to the truth. To this day he remains there, isolated from all he once loved, alone for all eternity. That is the legend of Polaris, the legend of the North Star.